related to the 2020 presidential election, the January 6th attack on the Capitol. And they also requested a meeting with Roberts as soon as possible. And Roberts refused on both counts. He refused to meet with the senators, saying, apart from ceremonial events, only on rare occasions in our nation's history has a sitting Chief Justice met with legislators. And he refused to get involved in the request for Alito to recuse at all, saying, members of the Supreme Court recently reaffirmed the practice we have followed for 235 years, pursuant to which individual justices decide recusal issues. This is the second time in less than a year that there have been ethical controversies surrounding Justice Alito. Isn't it time for Roberts to get involved?
Well, he certainly could step in. The other justices on occasions in the past have chosen to prevent justices who they thought were impaired from participating in decisions. There are 7 justices that do not have these questions about them, and they could simply decide that they will not hand down any decisions in which Justice Alito's vote is decisive, or if they are similarly concerned with the ethical questions about Justice Thomas, in which either of their votes are decided. If they do that, they still have a solid conservative majority, and the outcomes of cases might well not change, but the public confidence certainly would be much higher.
Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal has also suggested that the Chief Justice should just refuse to assign opinions to Alito and Thomas.
That's completely within the Chief Justice's authority, but I'm not sure what that accomplishes. Justices on the Supreme Court exercise much of their power through their votes, and unless the individual justice recuses themselves or the other justices refuse to allow that justice's vote to be decisive, then the compromised justice will still be able to participate and still have great power.
Senator Durbin said he's not going to hold any hearings on this or do anything further. But unless Congress does something further, this is going to continue, isn't it? With justices not recusing themselves when it seems apparent they should. Another example is Justice Clarence Thomas taking part in January 6th cases when his wife had some involvement there. I mean, there seems to be no way to force ethical obligations on these justices when they're deciding for themselves, and no one is overlooking that.
Well, there are several people that could impose those ethical obligations on them, but none are willing. The justices themselves could do so. There's ample precedent of not engaging in overt political activity when you're sitting on the court and not taking valuable gifts from parties with interests in front of the court. So the justices could do it themselves. The other 7 justices could do it for them by refusing to allow those two to cast deciding votes in cases where they're compromised. Congress could do it by passing legislation. The Constitution says that the Supreme Court's jurisdiction is subject to any exceptions Congress wishes to make, and Congress could simply say that the court has no jurisdiction in cases in which justices are compromised. And Congress could impeach and remove one or more justices. The fact is that Congress isn't going to do that because the voters have not demanded that Congress do that and have not insisted that their representatives in Congress be willing to hold the court to a higher standard.
Reading Alito's letter, it just seems to me that he's just not self-aware. He may be smart, he may be brilliant even, but he's not self-aware. He writes this about his wife. She makes her own decisions, and I have always respected her right to do so. And it seems so ironic to me, considering his decision to take away every woman's right to choose to decide what to do with her own body.
Well, it is, and the notion of hiding behind one's wife to excuse one's conduct is one that unfortunately men have used throughout the years, not to empower women, but to exploit them, and in that sense, this fits with the pattern. It's also striking that he expresses such ambivalence about what these flags mean when quite recently he wrote a concurring opinion in a case about flying flags in Boston City Hall, in which he said flags are very important.
And in this one he said, my wife likes flying flags, I don't.
Which suggests that flags are not very important. So which is it, Justin?
He wants to have it both ways, I guess. Thanks so much, David. That's Professor David Super of Georgetown Law. And that's it for this edition of the Bloomberg Law Show. I'm June Grosso. Stay with us. Today's top stories and global business headlines are coming up right now.
From the financial capital of the world, broadcasting 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com and the Bloomberg Business app. This is WBBR New York, Bloomberg 1130. Now, our global news update. Former President Trump says his trial shows that, quote, if they can do this to me, they can do it to anyone. Speaking yesterday from Trump Tower in New York City, Trump slammed Thursday's guilty verdict in his hush money trial. He went after the Manhattan DA who brought the case, saying Democrat Alvin Bragg was out to get him and instead should focus on violent crime in his city. The former president was found guilty on all 34 counts in the case. Trump's attorney, Todd Blanche, says his client was part of the team.
I mean, very involved. And he's a smart guy. He knows what he's doing. He jokingly said to us a lot, sometimes he wanted to be the litigator. You know, he wanted to be the one that was actually arguing.
Trump still has his supporters. Immediately following his conviction, the Trump campaign reported raking in nearly $53 million in donations. The lawsuit challenging the near total ban on abortions in Texas has been dismissed by the state Supreme Court. More than 20 women say they were denied the procedure even though they claimed it was medically necessary. They say the rules for doctors which permit an abortion to save a mother's life are too vague. In their ruling on Friday, justices wrote that all pregnancies carry risk. The first crewed mission of Boeing's Starliner spacecraft is set for liftoff today from Cape Canaveral, Florida. Steve Stitch is program manager for NASA's Commercial Crew Program.
12:25 Eastern is the launch time, and we'll dock about 25 and a half hours later at about 1:50 p.m. on Sunday, June 2nd.
The veteran astronauts Butch Wilmore and Sonny Williams will spend a little over a week at the International Space Station testing Starliner to complete final certification to carry astronauts on future flights to the ISS. There are a number of things to keep an eye on in the upcoming business week. Reports start rolling in Monday with auto sales and construction spending data. Report on job openings follow the next day, with ADP then releasing its employment report on Wednesday, along with the latest stats on the U.S. trade deficit. I'm Rob Martier. The National Hurricane Center is gearing up for what is expected to be an extremely active season. National Hurricane Center Director Dr. Michael Brennan says rapidly intensifying storms are a real concern.
We have better tools, better data from the Hurricane Hunter aircraft that we're getting into our model. And that's for the non-forecasters here, the confidence to make more aggressive intensity forecasts to set the stage and the expectations properly for those hazards, especially the storm surge hazard.
Hurricane season starts today. About 85 to 90% of tropical system deaths in the U.S. are caused by rainfall, flooding, storm surge, and surf and rip currents. By mid-August, the Hurricane Center is set to debut its experimental cone that includes the inland extent of tropical storm watches and warnings. Google says it's updated its artificial intelligence systems after it was found giving users false information. The feature would give people AI-generated summaries at the top of their Google search results, but users quickly noticed it was providing incorrect or bizarre answers. On Friday, Google announced it made more than a dozen technical improvements to its AI program. The same day, the head of Google's search business said although the product was tested thoroughly before release, there's nothing quite like having millions of people using the feature with many novel searches. President Biden will mark the 80th anniversary of D-Day in Normandy, France next week. Tammy Trujillo reports.
Biden will deliver remarks and meet with American veterans and their family members to honor the landing of Allied troops in Normandy during World War II. The invasion on June 6, 1944 marked the beginning of the liberation of Europe from Nazi Germany from the West.
The San Diego Police Department is deploying a new drone for critical incidents. The drone is a donation from SDG&E and will allow officers to use the surveillance technology for longer periods of time. Instead of a battery-powered drone that has to land and recharge every 10 to 20 minutes, the drone is tethered to a power source, allowing it to fly for several hours at 200 feet. I'm Rob Martier.
And I'm Denise Pellegrini in the Bloomberg Newsroom.
South Africa's African National Congress sets a seat its parliamentary majority for the first time ever. That's after voters dealt a historic rebuke to the party Nelson Mandela led to power at the end of apartheid. With almost 98% of ballots cast and the May 29 election counted, the ANC has 40.2% of the vote, while a party led by former ANC and national president Jacob Zuma garnered 14.8% of the vote just 5 months after launch. The ANC collapse comes after years of economic mismanagement and corruption, and the result means the ANC now has to consider working with its political opponents for the first time to stay in power. Security tightened New York City ahead of tomorrow's annual Israel Day parade. New York Mayor Eric Adams saying most protests over the war between Israel and Hamas have been peaceful, but
we are not going to allow any unlawfulness and any disruption of any celebration of one heritage in the city.
And the theme of tomorrow's parade, Adams is talking about there is bring them home now, referring to hostages still held by Hamas. Meantime, as we've been reporting, fighting continues with Israel attacks on Hamas in Rafah today in Gaza, even as the U.S. presses for progress on a ceasefire after President Biden unveiled that Israeli proposal for a ceasefire process yesterday. Toyota Motor has apparently informed Japan's transport ministry of irregularities at their firm. The Yomiuri newspaper says that's following a series of safety test violations by Toyota Group affiliates. The ministry and automakers, including Toyota, planning to announce findings as early as Monday, according to the paper. And S&P Global Ratings downgrading France. We get more on that from Bloomberg's Charlie Pellet.
It tarnishes President Emmanuel Macron's record for debt management as his government struggles to get a grip on public finances in the wake of the COVID pandemic and energy crisis. In a statement, the credit assessor said that although reforms and a recovery in economic growth will allow the country to reduce its budget deficit, the gap will remain above 3% of gross domestic product in 2027. The downgrade to AA- from AA puts France 7 notches above junk on S&P's scale, on a par with the Czech Republic and Estonia. The outlook on the rating is stable. Charlie Pellet, Bloomberg Radio.
Thank you, Charlie. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it. With Bloomberg News Now, I'm Denise Pellegrini and this is Bloomberg.
Now a sports update on Bloomberg 1130.
Now this Bloomberg Sports Update. Aaron Judge goes yard twice in San Francisco. Yankees crushed the Giants 6-2 in the series opener. 7 2/3 innings, 2-run ball for the winner, Marcus Stroman. Mets, they beat the Diamondbacks 10-9 at Citi Field. J.D. Martinez, his 5th homer. And Sabrina Ionescu had 24 points. Liberty, they beat the Mystics. And the Oilers, they outlast the Stars. They're up 3-2, heading back north with your Bloomberg Sports Update. I'm Rob Bushka.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
Hi everyone, welcome to the weekend edition of Bloomberg Business Week. Top of mind this week, former President Donald Trump was convicted on all 34 counts in his New York hush money trial, a landmark jury verdict making him the first former American president to be found guilty of felony crimes. His sentencing now set for July 11th. All the details can be found on Bloomberg.com and, of course, on the Bloomberg terminal.
Our focus is on presidential candidate Donald Trump, now that we are about 5 months away from the November U.S. election, and on the concerns of some voters about Trump forever. We'll explain what that means in just a moment.
Plus, Jamie Dimon says there could be hell to pay if one alt asset class sours. We talk private credit with the folks over at Moody's.
And how money and markets really work. In this economy? That's the title of a new book by financial educator, commentator, and Bloomberg opinion contributor Kyla Scanlon. Now, if her name sounds familiar, it's because she coined the word and the whole concept of the Vibesession.
Yeah, great conversation coming up there. All of that to come. We begin with the November presidential race. As the rematch between Joe Biden and Donald Trump draws closer, political professionals are detecting an unusual concern for some undecided voters. The fears of not just 4 more years of Donald Trump, but Trump forever.
And as far-fetched as it may sound, the prospect of Donald Trump, should he find himself back in the Oval Office, and then never leaving, is weighing big time on the minds of some voters. So writes our Bloomberg Business Week national correspondent Josh Green. His story featured in the latest edition of Business Week magazine, out on newsstands now, on the Bloomberg terminal, and at Bloomberg.com/businessweek.
Josh is also the author of The Rebels, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, AOC, and the Rise of the New Left. Also author of Devil's Bargain, Steve Bannon, Donald Trump, and the Storming of the Presidency.
We spoke to Josh before the Trump verdict.
I've been talking to Republican and Democratic strategists recently who mentioned that they were seeing something strange in the focus groups and polls they were conducting, and that is that a lot of swing voters were worried that Trump was going to declare himself president for life if he's reelected in November. And as I did some reporting on the source of these worries, basically this is something that Trump likes to joke about. Of course, there was the January 6th riots that gave a lot of people pause. But it's a factor that I think isn't being paid a lot of attention to, but both Republican and Democratic strategists are seeing it and wondering if this is going to have an effect on the outcome in November.
You know, it's interesting, and Josh, we don't certainly have to tell you, but this idea that Donald Trump will say something and people are like, well, that's Donald Trump. Like, you know what I mean? They're kind of dismissive. Is there something, though, different as he runs for a second go at the White House?
Yeah, I think there are a couple things. I mean, as you mentioned, you know, the Trump people sort of laugh this off as this is just Trump being Trump. You know, he likes to say outrageous things to get a rise out of liberals. He's talked a little bit about, well, should I maybe serve 3 terms? But while a lot of people write it off as just Trump being Trump, this particular group of voters seems to be listening to it and worrying about it. And as strategists have kind of plumbed the reason for this, they've come up with some interesting theories. And the best one I heard was that it was really, what was driving this fear was the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe versus Wade. A Democratic strategist told me that what that did was convince a lot of ordinary voters that things they wouldn't have imagined possible, like Roe versus Wade being overturned, or Trump abolishing term limits, suddenly seemed real enough that these voters were worrying about it, and it seemed to be pushing at least some of them back into Joe Biden's camp.
Well, you get into the piece that the idea of the president serving only 2 terms, whether consecutive or not, hasn't been in the Constitution since the days of the Founding Fathers by any means. It was ratified in the 1950s after FDR served more than 2 terms. Can you talk a little bit about the history of presidents since 1950, talking about the potential repeal of the 22nd Amendment, or at least alluding to the idea of serving more than 2 terms?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I did a kind of a deep dive in this piece, what was interesting was almost immediately when the 22nd Amendment, after the 22nd Amendment was passed, popular presidents and their advisors in both parties have kind of objected to it. Ronald Reagan said in 1987 he would like to overturn it. Democrats in the House of Representatives twice, once during Bill Clinton's presidency, once during Barack Obama's, tried to push legislation overturning it. So it's something that popular presidents sort of chafe at. But that being said, the hurdle to actually get it overturned and abolish term limits is almost unthinkably difficult. It would require large majorities in both houses of Congress. It would require large majorities of state legislatures to approve it. So it's not something that's plausibly going to happen. And yet still, people have learned that Trump is a norm breaker. It's something that gives them pause, and it's weighing on them as they make their decision on who to vote for in November.
Hey, Josh, there are focus groups, and then there are focus groups by those who have been doing them for some time that maybe you sit up a little bit straighter and take note. Like, I just do wonder, is this something that just makes everybody kind of be like, wait a minute, there's something different this time around?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what's going on. I mean, if you go back to 2020 and the January 6th uprising, it's sort of shaken a lot of people and made them realize that, well, like, maybe things aren't as smooth as we expect. Historically, when we conduct these focus groups and we throw out these kind of wild scenarios, voters usually push back and say, oh, that could never happen. I was able to sit in on a couple of these and sort of see this myself, and people are just much more willing to believe that crazy things can happen, and that maybe one of those crazy things will be Trump declaring himself president for life. As implausible as that sounds, I think, to most voters.
Well, I was struck by a woman who you spoke to who actually said that she would vote for Biden even if he is in a coma, despite the fact that back in 2016 she voted for former President Trump during that election. Talk to me a little bit about her thinking, Josh, and how this could move the needle with the undecided voters.
Yeah, well, the people I was focusing on in this piece really were that narrow group of undecided voters who are going to decide the election. A lot of committed Republicans like it when Trump talks about abolishing term limits. A lot of Democrats like to get upset about it, but their votes aren't really up for grabs on either side. So the focus of these focus groups and the voters that I talked to were people who had either been former Trump voters, former Biden voters, were now undecided. The woman you mentioned, Laura McCammon, the grandmother in Wisconsin I talked to, voted for Trump in 2016, but as she's witnessed January 6th, she's listened to MAGA media figures like Steve Bannon talk about multiple terms. It scared her into deciding that she wouldn't risk another vote for Donald Trump. And she told me, as you said, she's planning to vote for Biden in November no matter what.
Hey, while we have you, and one thing we wanted to ask you, and this is certainly a story that we've been talking about this week a lot, and this has to do with Donald Trump, a video posted to his social media, that referenced a unified right as a potential news headline if he won a second term. Devil's Bargain bestseller, you really got inside Steve Bannon and the road to the White House for Donald Trump the first go-round. How are you thinking about some of the terminology that's being used, the rhetoric that's being used by Donald Trump?
Well, this is something that we've seen going all the way back to Trump's first run in 2015 and 2016, that kind of winking at the far right, either through phrases or memes or videos or what have you. I don't know whether this was intentional or not, but given Trump's background, given the praise he heaped on some of the Charlottesville protesters in 2017, another earlier controversy over anti-Semitism, it's something that people in the press and people in the electorate, I think, are very alert to. So if something like this pops up in a Trump video, you see the media pouncing, you see the attention to it, and it's something that the Trump campaign, either intentionally or unintentionally, hasn't really managed to fix and bottle up and kind of clean up their campaign.
Right.
But I think we can see based on this, it's something that we're going to have to keep an eye on going forward.
That was Bloomberg Businessweek national correspondent Josh Green.
Also this past week, J.P. Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon says he expects problems to emerge in private credit and warned that there could be hell to pay. That's a quote, particularly as retail clients gain access to the booming asset class.
J.P. Morgan and other lenders have been competing with the $1.7 trillion private credit industry, with giants such as Apollo Global Management taking on ever larger deals. We got an update and talked risks with Anna Arsov, Global Head of Private Credit and Financial Institutions at Moody's Investor Service.
Everybody wants a piece of this action, meaning either to invest in a business or build a business. When the business is relatively mature, and particularly now with the opening of the leveraged finance market, and I'm talking about direct lending specifically, we are worried that credit terms will suffer, and eventually there will be deals were done, maybe less prudentially when there was less competition, particularly between the public and the private markets in leveraged lending. So we are concerned, and we're seeing actually credit term deterioration. We're seeing competition for talent as well, and at the same time, a lot of dry powder being raised that has to be deployed, and maybe deployed at terms that are going to be less favorable for creditors in the near term and medium term.
All right, so bummer for the creditors, right? The folks who need to borrow the money. But having said that, the idea that so many people want to be a part of it, doesn't that, I'm playing devil's advocate a little bit, but doesn't that kind of spread around the risk in the private credit market so that there's not just, one entity, one lending entity, if you will, that's kind of stuck holding the bag if things go wrong?
That is, diversification is always good at risk. The issue is that, and our statistics have shown that the biggest fundraising actually is going now increasingly to the largest players. So therefore, this is becoming a more concentrated market. This has been a more concentrated market, both on the private equity side, but particularly on private credit. Fundraising is indeed going to the largest, more established players. So with that being said, diversification is very interesting because it is the same pension funds, the insurance company who are investing on the private equity side, and also, or sovereign funds are also investing in the private credit side. So they're all increasing their exposure. The good thing is here that from a systemic risk perspective, these are different funds with different investments that are underlying. So there's no that big concentration of one type of a risk, let's call it, subprime mortgage, US subprime mortgage, or US office, commercial real estate in one type of fund. It's diversified to many real money investors that have a long-term perspective and long-term investment horizon, and also without necessarily immediate liquidity call or risk. So that's the good about this market. You're absolutely right. Diversification of the investment community, and also not imminent liquidity draw that these kind of investors are coming in with.
When I'm wondering, are you going to come on our show and say that private credit is not hot?
So if you think about where we are and what inning, a lot of us have been talking about private credit as equivalent to direct lending. And direct lending is just not a middle market, now expanding to larger middle market leverage finance business. But private credit is beyond that. There's a lot of talk about potentially the ABS private credit market, which, if you listen to various pundits, anywhere between 10 and 40 trillion, any kind of asset from any bank that potentially can be sold is that is that aircraft receivables, is that potentially data centers, or as plain as even commercial real estate that potentially can be packaged in a private securitization that will have basically be deployed into the kind of the investment community, same insurance companies, pension funds, family funds. So therefore, if you take a broader picture of private credit, of any credit provision that's not done by the banks but financing our economy, that means that this is going to be, here to stay for quite a long time.
That was Anna Arsov, Global Head of Private Credit and Financial Institutions at Moody's Investors. Check out the full conversation on our podcast feed at Bloomberg.com.
Coming up, cloud, on-premise, where to find Gen AI with the Global Chief Technology Officer at Dell.
You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week. This is Bloomberg.
Now your 3-day weather forecast on